You've seen it in movies, you've seen it in museums, but do you really know the truth? This is the story of the Sherman tank, not from the textbooks, but from the mud, metal, and fire of World War II. To some, it was the machine that helped win the war. To others, it was a moving death trap. But the reality was different. Before World War II, the US didn't think that tanks would play a major role in battle. Most of their tanks were light, small, and outdated. The best they had at the time? The M1 combat car and the M2 light tank. Both were no match for German armor. By the time America saw what Germany was doing with tanks, especially in fast blitzkrieg attacks, it was already behind. Worse, the US had only built around 300 tanks total. They had no factories ready, no mass production systems, and barely any experience. They needed something, fast. The first Band-Aid solution was the M3 Lee. It had two guns, a small one in a turret and a larger 75mm field gun stuck into the side of the tank hull. It was awkward, bulky, and not ideal for fast combat. But it was what they had, and it gave soldiers at least a chance to fight in North Africa. It wasn't perfect, but it bought them time. Time to build something better. American engineers got to work. They watched what was happening in Europe. They studied German and British tank designs. They needed a tank that was quick, reliable, and easy to build. The result? The M4 Sherman. It had a 75mm medium velocity gun, better armor than anything before it, and it could be built in massive numbers. It was also light enough to be lifted by cranes and small enough to fit on ships and trains. The Sherman rolled onto the battlefield in late 1942, just in time for the Second Battle of El Alamein. The British needed new tanks badly, and the Sherman delivered. The first thing soldiers noticed? The Sherman was reliable. In the harsh desert of North Africa, where dust and heat shut down many tanks, the Sherman kept going. It was easy to repair, parts were standard across models, and mechanics could fix them quickly. Thanks to America's car industry, Sherman parts were mass-produced and interchangeable, a mechanic's dream during the war. The gun was strong enough to deal with Panzer III and early Panzer IV models, and it even had a primitive stabilization system, meaning it could fire while moving, a big deal at the time. But that early praise wouldn't last. Here's where the cracks started to show. The Sherman's main weapon, a short-barreled 75mm gun, wasn't really designed for tank battles. It was made to support infantry. That means it fired more high-explosive shells than armor-piercing ones. And that's fine if you're shooting bunkers or buildings. Not so great when you're up against Tigers or upgraded Panzers. Why was the barrel so short to make shipping easier? If the gun stuck out too far, it wouldn't fit on trains or ships. That's exactly what happened with the Easy 8's gun. It had to be trimmed just to fit into cargo holds. It made sense on paper, but on the battlefield, it meant trouble. By the time the Sherman reached Europe, things had changed. The Germans had improved their tanks. The Panzer IV now had a high-velocity 75mm gun. And then came the Tiger I with an 88mm cannon that could destroy a Sherman from over a mile away. The Sherman had to get dangerously close, almost point-blank range, to even hope for a kill. That's if it could flank the enemy and shoot from the side or rear. Face a Tiger head-on? Forget it. And it didn't help that the Sherman was one of the tallest tanks on the battlefield. Still, the US and its allies doubled down. Why? While the Sherman was outgunned, it could be built faster than any German tank. The real power of the Sherman wasn't its gun or armor, it was the factory. At its peak, one Sherman came off the assembly line every 30 minutes. Over 50,000 units were made by the end of the war. Factories like Chrysler's Detroit Arsenal tank plant churned them out with incredible speed. And that mattered. The thinking was, even if a Sherman couldn't win a one-on-one fight, 5 Shermans could gang up on one Tiger, and then keep going. But what about the crews inside those tanks? One of Sherman's most feared flaws wasn't just being outgunned, it was what happened after it got hit. Early versions had their ammunition stored in the sidewalls, in unprotected metal boxes. If the armor was pierced, sparks and shrapnel would hit the shells, setting off huge fires. This gave the Sherman some awful nicknames: Tommy Cooker, Ronson, and Zippo, because it lit up every time. Statistically, 7 out of 10 Shermans hit in combat would catch fire immediately, and it wasn't the gas engine like some people thought. The real problem was the ammo placement. That would change, but only after enough lives were lost to force it. And when crews began calling their own tanks coffins, engineers finally started listening. To fix the fire problem, US engineers made one big change. They moved the ammo. Instead of keeping shells in the tank's side walls, right where enemy rounds could easily hit them, they moved the storage down to the floor. But they didn't stop there. They surrounded these new ammo bins with a water glycol mixture. This liquid wasn't flammable, and it helped smother sparks or flames if the tank was hit. This new setup was called wet stowage, and it worked big time. The chance of a Sherman bursting into flames dropped from 70% to below 20%. It didn't make the tank invincible, but it gave crews a better chance of surviving a hit. Sadly, many older Shermans without this system were still in use and still burning. As the Allies pushed deeper into Europe, Sherman crews were running into newer, deadlier German tanks. The Tiger I and Panther weren't just bigger. They were far more powerful. The Tigers had 88mm high-velocity cannons that could destroy a Sherman from more than a mile away. The Panther wasn't far behind, with its long-barreled 75mm gun and thick, sloped armor. A Sherman's best hope was to get close and hit the side or rear of these monsters. But getting that close usually meant getting shot first. In one terrifying battle, 17 out of 18 Shermans were knocked out in just 20 minutes. Some crews were so scared of Tigers, they mistook ordinary Panzer IVs for them, because the fear was that deep. So how did Sherman crews deal with it? They adapted. They hit in groups. They moved fast. And they tried to flank, but often they paid in blood. Tank crews knew their armor wasn't enough, so they took matters into their own hands. They started strapping sandbags, spare track links, logs, and even concrete to their tank. Anything to stop a round, or at least slow it down. Commanders didn't like this. It made the tank heavier, slower, and more likely to break down. But the crews didn't care. They were the ones getting hit, and they knew how thin the factory-made armor really was. Eventually, real improvements came, like sloped frontal armor, turret upgrades, and extra hatches to escape faster in an emergency. But at the start, it was survival by creativity. There was one dangerous flaw that few people think about: the missing loader's hatch. In early Shermans, only the commander and driver had hatches to escape through. The loader didn't. If the tank got hit, he had to crawl over or under the gun to reach someone else's hatch. That cost lives. One veteran told a story of getting trapped inside. His commander and gunner were killed instantly. The tank filled with smoke. He had seconds to act. The gun happened to be rotated just enough for him to crawl underneath, reach the front, and escape through the driver's hatch. After enough stories like that, engineers finally added a dedicated hatch for the loader, along with springs to help open it quickly. It was a small fix, but one that saved lives. Let's talk about Sherman's armor. It wasn't thick, it wasn't sloped enough, and it was softer than German armor. That sounds bad, and often it was. But strangely, this softer steel had one benefit. When German tanks were hit, their harder armor shattered, sending deadly steel fragments flying around inside the tank. That's what killed most crews. Shermans didn't do that as much. When they got hit, the armor would break, but not explode into 1,000 knife-like pieces. So, while it was easier to penetrate, it was slightly safer for the crew inside. So, was the Sherman a hero or a death trap? Maybe it was both. It wasn't the most powerful. It wasn't the most armored. It wasn't the most feared, but it was the most dependable, the most available, and the most used. And that's the dark truth. The M4 Sherman didn't win because it was great. It won because it was good enough, for just long enough. And in war, sometimes, that's all it takes.